Postmodernism is not a term that is simply defined. It is a term characterized by its ambiguity. It can be understood in two facets, the historical period and the mood. Postmodernism is a historical period insofar as it is whatever exists after the modern period. The mood comes from a realization that we're condemned to live in a present characterized by contradiction and incoherence. The postmodern mood is an attitude that addresses and embraces this incoherence. It embraces the unknowable nature of the universe and casts doubt upon any claims of objectivity. It rejects the knowledge claims of modernism. Consistency, continuity, and determinism were no longer seen as necessary. This postmodern mood influenced postmodernism as an aesthetic style, which is the topic of this essay. Although it's difficult to draw any hard conclusions over the influence of postmodernism on art due to its varied and indefinite nature, there are certain influential features and ideals that influence the postmodern aesthetic. These include the rejection of the modernist movements, complexity and contradiction, discontinuity, richness over clarity, many levels of meaning, a combination of forms and styles, decoration and ornament for its own sake, and a focus on the viewer's value system and subjective experience rather than seeking to impose the director's values. We will use these commonalities to examine postmodern architecture and cinema and how artists have interpreted and adapted certain ideals that are commonly found in postmodern thought. We will then compare how this has shaped the postmodern movements within the respective art forms. Postmodernist architecture is fundamentally linked to modernist architecture. Postmodern architects very clearly reject the styles that emerged in the 1920s, namely the international style. This style, typified by the buildings of Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, and Frank Lloyd Wright, dominated the architectural landscape following World War II. This style stripped a building down to all that was necessary. They saw that buildings have a specific purpose, such as domestic or industrial, as well as a higher purpose to improve the human condition through the design of a pure and functional physical environment. What did not serve this purpose was deemed unnecessary and removed. The international style coveted clean, functional buildings with minimal decoration. One of the intentions was to make a style that could be made anywhere in the world. This design philosophy was said to be a rationally arrived at conclusion. They used this rationality to claim authority over normative questions about the aesthetics as well as the construction methods and materials of buildings. This grand unifying theory was seen by postmodernist architects as a meta-narrative. The architectural postmodernists rejected this meta-narrative, drawing upon Jean-François Lyotard's skepticism of the meta-narrative. He defines the postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives, meaning the postmodernists are often skeptical of the existence of any objective unifying theory. Robert Venturi was very influential in the architectural adaptation of this incredulity. He embraced the complexity that comes with abandoning the meta-narrative, stating that the main approach of mine, of our firm, is that we have emphasized an architecture which promotes richness over simplicity. He believed in the subjective value of buildings that were nostalgic echoes of the past rather than those dwellings that were pure and austere statements of orthodox modernism. Similarly, he believes in the use of historical symbolism that is specific to the region. This evokes a sense of nostalgia and results in a building that doesn't stand out. This creates a kind of architectural subjectivism. Buildings are designed for the individual conditions. Similar to how postmodernism embraces inconsistency in the face of the postmodern world, Venturi holds up an ideal of buildings that are vestigial as well as innovating, boring as well as interesting, inconsistent and equivocal. It is this philosophy that influenced the design of 550 Madison Avenue, also known as the AT&T building. The AT&T building was designed by Philip Johnston for the Manhattan headquarters of the titular telecommunication company. It is composed of three distinct sections: the base, the main shaft, and a broken pediment at the top. The main entrance at the base has a large arch which may have been influenced by the Basilica of Sant'Andrea in Mantua, Italy. The interior granite columns are reminiscent of the Tuscan style with contemporary fluting on the shafts. The broken pediment is a clear reference to classical architecture, the broken pediment being common in Roman Corinthian architecture. Johnston claims he was influenced in this regard by Al-Khazaneh in Jordan. The rounded opening is a postmodern spin on the broken pediment, also leaving a space symbolizing the AT&T logo. Finally, the main shaft is unmistakably modern. This also follows the Venturian ideal that all buildings should evoke nostalgia and shouldn't stand out. The evocation of modernism is due to the historical symbolism of the modern skyscraper in New York. The city's skyline is modern, so it makes sense that the main section of the building is modern. Although, what tops the building, what is above all, is a postmodern take on classicism, symbolizing a company entering into the futuristic world of the internet. Johnston uses modernism to subvert modernism by placing it amongst older styles of architecture as well as the current style, postmodernism, with a symbol of the future atop it. The building is a hybrid of styles and time periods, creating a purposefully disunified vision of the postmodern world. In this world, the continuity of time and linear progression of history are irrelevant meta-narratives. Instead, he proposes a world of time happening all at once. The continuity of time is not a linear line, but a mesh. It is this mesh which creates many meanings at once. Johnston embraces Foucault's subject, meaning he designs the elements so that they can be interpreted as the subject sees fit. Postmodernist architecture doesn't pretend in the modernist way that its form is related to its function. They are simple buildings in that their purpose is their existence and their meaning is not predetermined. The meaning is to be discovered and interpreted by the onlooker, the worker, and the neighbour. It is these elements of disunity and creation of multiple subjective meanings that were the result of the adaptation of postmodern philosophy in architecture. Postmodern theory influenced postmodern cinema through the deconstruction of cinematic styles and techniques and the representation of time. Beginning with the breaking down of genre and style, postmodern theory then moved to question film as a medium itself. We will begin with the breaking down of genre and style, which was influenced heavily by Lyotard. The modernist cinema was divided into two types: the narrative film, which was fictional, and the documentary film, which was non-fictional. Upon postmodern examination, however, these narratives came undone. For one, what was presented in documentary was not fact. It was shot through a narrow lens, edited together to the whims of the filmmakers in order to create a narrative, whether the filmmaker intended to or not. Narrative films, as seen by directors like Abbas Kiarostami, were not always fiction. Kiarostami found the understanding that narrative films were fiction to be a limiting meta-narrative. Thus, he rejected the divide between documentary and narrative. He mixes the two styles, therein embracing the contradiction. Two examples of this come from Through the Olive Trees and The Taste of Cherry. Here is the beginning of the former.
من محمد علی کشاورز هستم، بازیگر که در این فیلم نقش کارگردان بازی میکنم. سایر بازیگران همه محلی هستن. ما الان در محلی هستیم به اسم کوکر، تقریباً 350 کیلومتری تهران که سال گذشته زلزله نسبتاً شدید اینجا رو به کلی ویران کرد.
بچه‌ها گرسنه‌ان، راهشون هم دوره. اگر ممکنه یکم سریع‌تر.
ما الان جلوی یه مدرسه تازه ساز هستیم برای اینکه یه بازیگر دختر انتخاب بکنیم.
Similarly, in The Taste of Cherry, Kiarostami subverts this divide at the end of his film to suggest that the divide is superficial. Throughout the film, Kiarostami takes great care to slowly immerse the audience in the very personal story of a suicidal man's life. Kiarostami chooses to break that immersion in the final scene by showing us video camera documentary-style clips of the crew filming certain scenes. The main actor is seen sharing a cigarette with the director. It blends fiction with reality to emphasize the closeness of the two. Kiarostami believes that works of fiction can be just as reflective and honest as documentaries. By using this documentary style at the end, Kiarostami is showing us that the events you saw are just as equally a documentary as a work of fiction and insisting upon its meaning. He draws upon the postmodern rejection of the meta-narrative that fiction and truth are divided, in turn to show there is no inherent or objective difference between the two. Additionally, postmodern ideas influence the breaking down of the conception of cinema as an art form. Thinkers like Gilles Deleuze attempted to dispel modernist materialist conceptions of what cinema is in his works Cinema 1, The Movement Image, and Cinema 2, The Time Image. He contends that film is not an illusion formed of successive still photographs representing an external reality, as modernists theorized. Instead, he proposes that cinema is an ontological practice that creates different ways of organizing movement and time. This is due to the fundamental differences between the still image and the image presented in cinema. What makes it different is continuity. Continuity arises from cinema's similarity to our internal framing. That is, cinema mimics the way we see the world and naturally frame things with our eyes. Our minds become so ensnared in the movement image that after it has ended, our minds continue to create that image. Take this image, for example. Despite the pause rendering the image still, it continues in our minds. Deleuze calls this the movement image and uses it to argue that cinema is fundamentally different from the still image because it gives images in movement. Images in cinema are not a singular, unique movement, rather it is the continuity of movement that describes the image. Movement is inextricably linked with the perception of time through this continuity. However, in editing films, we must think beyond the singular movement image. From this, the time image is born. Deleuze posits that if the movement image is assimilated to the shot, we call framing the first facet of the shot turned towards objects, and montage the other facet turned towards the whole. The whole in this case encompasses time. It is made up of the time image. Thus, it is the montage itself which constitutes the whole, and thus gives us the image of time. Time is represented indirectly. It flows through the montage which links one movement image to another. The connection between the movement images is not a simple juxtaposition. He writes, "The whole is no more an addition than time is a succession of presents." In other words, the whole, meaning the overarching progress of time within a montage, is an emergent property of the editing of montage. The modernist montage uses the successive placement of present cut together to create a linear progression of time. This is not true of the postmodernist montage. The postmodernist montage, in comparison to the modernist montage, incites the creation of the whole within the mind of the audience non-linearly. An example of this can be found in Toshio Matsumoto's For the Damaged Right Eye. Here, he uses montage to detail the modern history of Japan. This is not achieved linearly, but through 3 consecutively played overlaying images. These images are not presented chronologically. We see images of the aftermath of nuclear bombs on one screen and the inside of a 60s nightclub on the other. It is up to the audience to interpret the events and the meanings of placement. The overall effect is the non-linear emergence of the whole. The creation of this whole is by each individual viewer. As our thoughts are non-linear, non-linearity prompts critical reflection using subjective experience and memory. They relate the perception images on screen to the chronosigns, chronological time, and their memory and experience to create personal meaning. Postmodern filmmakers were inspired by postmodern philosophy to place emphasis on the audience's subjective experience. The subversion of genre and style as well as chronosigns helped to create multiple subjective meanings. What conclusions can be drawn about each art form? Well, what does postmodernism show us about these forms? Both have works that draw back the curtains on form and function, emphasizing the subjective individual experience. This allowed postmodernists to question the accepted orthodoxy and concrete limitations of these art forms. Postmodernism has influenced an expansion of the definition of film. Postmodern cinema deconstructed cinematic styles and techniques in the representation of time, redefining what a film can be. The definition of architecture is also more free thanks to the influence of postmodernism. The international style has fallen out of fashion, alongside its dogmatic principles of design. This is thanks to the depth that comes with the incitation of multiple subjective meanings. This freedom also presents itself in film. We have also seen a mesh of temporal continuity within both these forms. They both utilize elements from the past to allow the creation of new meanings. In rejection of the international style and its preconceived notion of a building's purpose, postmodernist architecture brought back ornamentation. something that was seen as unnecessary. Modernist architects had a very clear idea of what is necessary and what is not in the context of buildings. For the most part, they leaned towards the minimal. Meanwhile, postmodernists tended towards the ornamental. In cinema, however, this dynamic was flipped. Modernist filmmakers more often than not had ideas on what was necessary to a film. For example, a film must have visuals, editing, or movement. It was the postmodern filmmakers that experimented with minimal filmmaking. For example, Andy Warhol's Empire, an 8-hour-long shot of the Empire State Building, or Derek Jarman's Blue, a drama where the only visual is a shade of blue.
Look left, look down, look up, look right. Blue flashes in my eyes.
Postmodern cinema is more focused on the subversion of form. This shows us the extent to which postmodernism is shaped by the previous modernist movement relative to the subject area. It shows us the limitations of using postmodernism as an overarching term because its influence manifested in two almost opposite ways in these two different art forms. Postmodernism, as a term, should thus be used cautiously. In all, the nature of both film and architecture has changed as a result of the adaptation of postmodern philosophy to the respective art form. Although the manifestation of postmodernism is different between the mediums, postmodernism has led to a creative liberty not just for the artist, but for the audience as well.